From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The current crisis on the U.S.-Mexico border is the worst I've ever seen it. I've been reporting on this issue for over 15 years, and we are at catastrophic levels. The way that we're treating human beings is in a way that we've never done in our past.
As scabies, shingles, and chickenpox spread among migrant children jailed by Border Patrol in Texas, we speak to the prize-winning journalist John Carlos Frey, author of the new book, Sand and Blood, America's Stealth War on the Mexico Border.
I wrote the book to expose our militarization at the U.S.-Mexico border. The stealth war at the U.S.-Mexico border includes casualties as well as all of the pieces of a real full-scale war right in our backyard.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A report by NBC shares new accounts of mistreatment and sexual violence experienced by locked-up migrant children at a Yuma, Arizona detention facility. In nearly 30 accounts collected by Health and Human Service case managers, children complained of hunger, having to sleep on concrete floors or outside, and lack of access to basic sanitation. A 15-year-old girl said an officer groped her underneath her clothing during what was supposed to be a routine pat-down and joked around with other agents during the ordeal. The Trump administration has dismissed reports of abuse against detained migrants despite recent congressional visits to migrant jails and multiple counts of mistreatment recorded by legal and other experts. Trump said migrants were very happy, while acting Homeland Security Secretary Kevin McAleenan called such accounts unsubstantiated. House Democrats have called on McAleenan to testify about the conditions faced by jailed migrants. Meanwhile, a new report from the New York Times and the El Paso Times details the ongoing dire situation at the Border Patrol station in Clint, Texas, where hundreds of migrant children are locked up without access to sufficient food, water, sanitation, beds, or proper medical care. Border agents reported spreading outbreaks of scabies, shingles, and chickenpox among the children. One staffer says he was ordered to remove beds from children to make more space in the overcrowded cells. The facility has been described by an expert who visited it as a child jail. In Washington, D.C., 18 Jewish activists with the group Never Again Action were arrested on Capitol Hill Tuesday as they protested against the jailing of migrants. They called on lawmakers to shut down the detention camps and defund ICE and CBP.
Congress once again voted to increase funding to ICE and CBP by passing a supplemental funding bill to send $4.6 billion to bankroll the criminalization, detention, and deportation of those seeking refuge at our southern border. We thank the 95 representatives who voted against funding hate and say shame to the 300.
Their banner read, "Never again means never again." In a statement, the activists said, quote, "As Jews, we know what the separation of families, the covert rounding up of people, and the creation of concentration camps can lead to. We refuse to wait and see what happens next." They also said, "We know what happens when people unaffected by crises act as bystanders and look the other way. We will not stay silent while our historical trauma is weaponized to distract from the terror that our government is unleashing on immigrant communities." A federal judge has rejected the Justice Department's attempt to replace the legal team charged with handling the Trump administration's case for adding a citizenship question on the 2020 census. U.S. District Judge Jesse Furman said the department's request was patently deficient and that they offered, quote, "no reasons, let alone satisfactory reasons, for the substitution of counsel," unquote. Meanwhile, House Democrats are expected to move forward with contempt proceedings against Attorney General William Barr and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross for defying subpoenas for documents related to the 2020 census. A Manhattan federal appeals court ruled Tuesday Trump is violating the Constitution when he blocks his critics on Twitter. Jamil Jaffer of Columbia University's Knight First Amendment Institute, which filed the lawsuit, said, quote, public officials' social media accounts are now among the most significant forums for discussion of government policy. This decision will ensure that people aren't excluded from these forums simply because of their viewpoints and that public officials aren't insulated from their constituents' criticism. It will help ensure the integrity and vitality of digital spaces that are increasingly important to our democracy, Jamil Jaffer said. Britain's ambassador to the United States, Kim Darroch, resigned today following the fallout from leaked cables in which he called Trump inept, insecure, and incompetent. In cables going back as far as 2017, Darroch questioned whether the Trump administration will ever look competent. He also said Trump's presidency could crash and burn and voiced fears that he may launch an attack on Iran. On Tuesday, Trump continued to lash out at Darroch, tweeting, "The wacky ambassador that the UK foisted upon the United States is not someone we are thrilled with, a very stupid guy," Trump said. He also called outgoing Prime Minister Theresa May foolish and blamed her for creating a mess of Brexit. Prime Minister May, who said earlier this week she stood by Ambassador Darroch, said in Parliament after his resignation today, quote, "Sir Kim has given a lifetime of service to the United Kingdom, and we owe him an enormous debt of gratitude. Good government depends on public servants being able to give full and frank advice. I hope the House will reflect on the importance of defending our values and principles, particularly when they're under pressure," she said. Opposition Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn also lamented Ambassador Darroch's resignation. In Afghanistan, an airstrike in the northern Baghlan province killed a family of 7 Tuesday, 6 of the victims' children, as 2 separate peace talks recently wrapped up in Qatar. The air raid by government forces followed an earlier land attack on a medical facility which killed at least 5 people. On Sunday, a Taliban car bomb killed at least 18 people and wounded more than 180 others, including dozens of children. The deaths came as Afghan leaders and Taliban officials ended a historic meeting with calls to reduce civilian casualties to 0. A 7th round of talks between the United States and the Taliban reiterated hopes for a peace deal before September elections. A federal appeals court Tuesday heard arguments in a key case that could help determine the fate of the Affordable Care Act. 21 Democratic attorneys general and the democratically led House of Representatives are challenging a decision by a Texas judge last December that ruled the individual mandate provision of Obamacare to be unconstitutional, effectively invalidating the act. 18 Republican state attorneys general and 2 Republican governors brought the original suit. Earlier this year, the Trump administration backed the ruling and said the ACA should be dismantled. The Fifth Circuit Appeals Court's ruling will likely be challenged by the opposing side, setting up the case for a Supreme Court battle. In New York City, fans are celebrating the U.S. women's soccer team's historic World Cup victory today with a ticker tape parade. The team won its record 4th World Cup Sunday, its 2nd consecutive win. The games also brought renewed attention to the team's struggle for equal pay. Earlier this year, they sued the U.S. Soccer Federation for gender discrimination. West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin introduced a bill Tuesday to withhold federal funding for U.S. participation in the 2026 FIFA World Cup unless the United States Soccer Federation implements equal pay for the women's soccer team. Outspoken co-captain Megan Rapinoe has also made headlines for her comments about Trump during the World Cup, saying, "I'm not going to the effing White House." On CNN Tuesday, Anderson Cooper asked Rapinoe what her message to President Trump is.
Your message is excluding people. You're excluding me. You're excluding people that look like me. You're excluding people of color. You're excluding, Americans that maybe support you. I think that we need to have a reckoning with the message that you have and what you're saying about Make America Great Again. I think that you're harking back to an era that was not great for everyone. It might have been great for a few people, and maybe America is great for a few people right now, but it's not great for enough Americans.
Megan Rapinoe also said the soccer team would be traveling to Washington, D.C. at the invitation of several lawmakers in Congress, but repeated she would not accept an invitation to the White House as she did not want her message or the team's platform to be co-opted. A few weeks ago, President Trump said win or lose, he would invite them to the White House, but more recently he said he had not thought about it and has not extended the invitation. More high-profile Democrats are calling on Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta to resign over the lenient 2007 plea deal given to serial child sex abuser Jeffrey Epstein when he was the U.S. prosecutor in Florida. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, and 2020 candidates, including Senators Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Bernie Sanders, said Acosta should step down. Acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney reportedly urged Trump to fire Acosta. According to Politico, Mulvaney is unhappy with Acosta's reluctance to dismantle workplace regulations and quash employment discrimination lawsuits. Secretary Acosta defended the plea deal on Twitter Tuesday and said he was, quote, pleased that New York prosecutors are moving forward with a case based on new evidence, unquote. No new evidence, many said, has been presented. Trump, meanwhile, praised Acosta and said he feels very badly for him while distancing himself from Epstein and not saying anything about the victims. Trump said he hadn't spoken to Epstein after a falling out 15 years ago and that Trump was, quote, not a fan of his. In 2002, Trump said Epstein was a terrific guy who, quote, likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side, Trump said. Trump will not explain what his falling out with Epstein was about. A white man who called the police on a black man after falsely accusing him of trespassing in San Francisco has apologized following a viral video showing the interaction, which happened on July 4th. The man, a manager at YouTube in San Francisco, was with his young son when he started questioning 35-year-old software engineer Wesley Michelle about why he was entering his building, accusing him of tailgating as the father and son opened the door to leave. The man's son can be heard pleading with his father not to call the police and to move on. He said he agreed with the man. The video was shot by Wesley Michelle.
Yeah, there's a trespasser in my building.
Daddy, please go.
Listen to your son.
Daddy, go.
1868
It's the better. I agree with him, Daddy. It's the better.
At Washington.
Let's go. Please, I don't like this. I don't like
He's
this.
standing in the lobby.
Daddy, I don't like this. Let's go.
He tailgated through the door as I left. He walked in.
Daddy, let's
I tailgated to the door.
He appears to be African American.
When Wesley Michelle's friend appears later in the video, the young boy says, "Told you, let's go now, Daddy. Look what you've gotten us into." The boy also said, "I agree with the man." Christopher Cooker, who has now been identified, issued an apology in a post for Medium Tuesday, saying he was sorry he, quote, caused Wesley to feel unfairly targeted due to his race. He added that his father was killed outside his home by a trespasser. In an interview with CNN, Wesley Michelle said the interaction, quote, mirrors the experience that African Americans endure daily, where we are questioned on whether we belong. He added he started filming to protect himself and get a true account of what happened if police got involved. The police did come, but said there was nothing wrong. Texas billionaire and two-time presidential candidate Ross Perot died Tuesday at the age of 89 after a battle with leukemia. Perot ran as an independent in 1992 and as a third-party candidate in 96. He won 19% of the vote in 92, finishing third behind Bill Clinton and George Bush Sr. Perot opposed the North American Free Trade Agreement and famously said a giant sucking sound going south of U.S. jobs going to Mexico would be heard if it passed. Perot founded the Reform Party in 1995. Donald Trump briefly ran an unsuccessful bid for the Reform ticket in 2000. Many argue Perot paved the way for Trump's presidency. Both ran as anti-free trade, populist political outsiders who preyed on voter anger. And billionaire Tom Steyer entered the crowded 2020 Democratic primary race Tuesday. The prominent Democratic donor and former hedge fund investor said he will put $100 million of his own money into his campaign, starting with television ads in key states. Steyer has repeatedly called for impeaching President Trump since Trump took office, but has focused his early campaign messaging on tackling climate change, creating a government-backed health care option, and tackling big oil, big pharma, and big banks. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who raised $19 million over the last quarter with an average donation of $28, tweeted Tuesday, the Democratic primary should not be decided by billionaires, whether they're funding super PACs or funding themselves. The strongest Democratic nominee in the general will have a coalition that's powered by a grassroots movement, she said. While Senator Bernie Sanders said of Steyer's bid, quote, I am a bit tired of seeing billionaires trying to buy political power, unquote. In more 2020 news, California Congressmember Eric Swalwell announced earlier this week he's dropping out of the presidential race. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. More than a week after lawmakers flocked to the U.S.-Mexico border to observe the horrible treatment of refugee children and families in immigration jails, reports of unsafe and unsanitary conditions for asylum seekers are continuing. In Clint, Texas, the Border Patrol station that garnered international attention for jailing hundreds of migrant children without access to sufficient food, water, beds, or medical care, now has a spreading outbreak of scabies, shingles, and chickenpox, according to border agents. The New York Times and the El Paso Times report that one staffer says he was ordered to remove beds from the jail to make more space in the overcrowded cells. Meanwhile, NBC reports that migrant children jailed in Yuma, Arizona, have been subjected to mistreatment and sexual violence in nearly 30 accounts collected by the Department of Health and Human Services case managers. Children complained of hunger, having to sleep on concrete floors or outside, and lack of access to basic sanitation. A 15-year-old girl said an officer groped her underneath her clothing during what was supposed to be a routine pat-down, and then joked around with other agents during the ordeal. Despite growing outrage from lawmakers, experts on child welfare, and the public, the Trump administration has dismissed reports of abuse. President Trump said migrants were, quote, very happy, while acting Homeland Security Secretary Kevin McAleenan called such accounts unsubstantiated. House Democrats have called on McAleenan to testify about the conditions forced by jail migrants.
Some are describing the conditions at the border as symptoms of a broken system, but others say this is exactly how U.S. immigration policies were designed to work. This is Texas State Representative Diego Bernal after visiting Border Patrol stations in El Paso last week.
People are saying that Trump's policies have failed. It's a phrase that people use a lot, and I disagree. I think they're working exactly the way they're supposed to. I think that everything that we're seeing and that's happened is on purpose, that it's deliberate, that it is the product of decisions that have been made, outcomes that have been anticipated, situations that were predicted, and this is exactly what they want.
Texas State Representative Diego Bernal. Well, we turn now to a book that examines the history of U.S. immigration policies, looking at how both Democrats and Republicans laid the groundwork for the deadly system we have today. Sand and Blood, America's Stealth War on the Mexico Border, tracks the increased militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border over more than 3 decades, arguing the borderlands have become a war zone. Author and journalist John Carlos Frey writes in his new book, "We're using a militaristic approach against an enemy that does not exist." As long as the push to fortify the border continues, as seems likely, no politician has yet challenged the assumed need for border security. The human costs will continue to accumulate, he writes. John Carlos Frey joins us now in our New York studio. He's a 5-time Emmy Award-winning investigative reporter and PBS NewsHour special correspondent, has reported extensively on immigration for more than a decade. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you in the studio.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So congratulations on your new book. I mean, the stories of what's happening on the border are terrifying.
Yes.
You have President Trump saying that the jailed migrants are, quote, very happy. And now you have this report by border agents themselves of the outbreak of scabies, chickenpox, shingles in the child jail at Clint. Can you talk about the overall picture there?
It's common. I even hate to say that out loud. This is the way that we treat migrants. This is policy. The facilities that we keep migrants in are not equipped to handle that large of a population. There are no beds in these facilities. There are no showers. There's no medical staff. There's no cafeteria. That's how we treat them. And this is on purpose. This policy has been in place for almost 20 years now. A policy of deterrence. If you come and you visit our jails, if you happen to be arrested and you go through the processing here, we want to rough you up. We want you to remember that if you come to the United States, you are not welcome, and we want that message to get all the way back to your home country so that other people do not attempt it. This idea of how children are being treated is also policy. This inhumane treatment of children is to send a message back to families saying, don't bring them. Don't bring your kids because they're not going to be treated well. And that is the deterrent strategy. I think the administration has even admitted so.
And I wanted to ask you, John Carlos, what about the role of Mexico in all of this? Now, obviously, there have been battles back and forth between the Mexican government and the various U.S. administrations about immigration policy. But there was a lot of expectation with the new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, that things would change. And what's your sense of what has happened as a result since López Obrador came into office?
Yeah, I know that the administration has put financial pressure on Mexico with the threat of tariffs if they didn't absorb this large population, but I don't think Mexico can either. We're talking about a country, for the most part, that's not welcoming as well. It's a profiteer off of the migration that goes through. Cartels extort these people. Women are raped on the journey. One of the reasons for the caravans that had formed starting last year was for safety, to get through Mexico. So migrants don't want to stay. So even though Trump says, keep these people, don't let them come all the way to the border, most people, if they're coming from Central America, don't want to stop in Mexico. They want to get through Mexico to the U.S. border. Migrants are allowed to choose where they want to go. We are not supposed to tell them where they can migrate to. If they're desperate, human rights advocates and charters basically say migrants are free to go where they choose.
You have, last week, yet another person dies in U.S. immigration custody. A Nicaraguan man became the 12th person to die in the custody of U.S. immigration authorities since September. You have something like 6 children have died in the last year. Before last year, a child didn't die in U.S. immigration custody in over a decade. Trump's immigration crackdown has also led to rapidly degrading and unsafe conditions for migrants forced to stay in Mexico. Reuters reporting migrants are being held without adequate food, water, health care for weeks on end in Mexican immigration jail without being provided information on their cases, the challenging of the Remain in Mexico policy that the Trump administration has put into place. Others challenging it, saying it's illegal to say no at the border. Democracy Now! Is there on the border as people who mother and a tiny daughter from Guatemala are left to stay in the hot baking sun day after day after day until finally people who are trying to do it the legal way through a legal port of entry realize that they may not survive. And so then they go a different route and perhaps they try to swim. Some of them die while swimming.
I've not seen it like this before. I've not seen us close the door to the degree that we have. I don't think that the administration, and I'm going to say Republicans in Congress for that matter, really care about these individuals. They're being portrayed as invaders. I think Trump has referred to them as an infestation. So if that's who they are, then why even bother giving them any chance at asylum? We have agreements with Mexico on how we're going to treat people who are coming to the U.S.-Mexico border. It is supposed to be humane. They are allowed to make a claim of asylum. We are supposed to bring them in, and they're supposed to wait for their day in court. That's the process. The courts are supposed to adjudicate the cases, not leaving them there in Mexico. I mean, if you can imagine making the decision to come from Central America to the U.S.-Mexico border out of desperation, getting to the border and then being told to wait for a few months. These people don't have jobs. They don't have money. They don't know people in Mexico. They're left to fend for themselves. There are shelters now popping up, but there's certainly not enough to handle this size of a population.
And you talk about shelters. In your book, you deal with the tremendous expansion of this detention apparatus, this industry that's developed. You mentioned that back in 1990, Border and Customs had about a budget of about $260 million. Today, it's up to $4 billion,
right.
A 16-fold increase in the budget of containing and corralling and guarding our borders, especially the southern border.
Congress just appropriated $4.6 billion more to handle the mass population. 75% of all our detention facilities in the United States are privately run. Children cost $750 a day to house. I don't know what that cost is when we have federal attorneys arguing that they don't even have toothbrushes and soap. So somebody is profiting here. In about 10 years ago, we had 5,000 people incarcerated, immigrants.
So
Today
you're saying $750 a day. So if a child is in detention
Correct.
for 10 days, the government has spent $7,500, which is about the cost of a years of a college education at a public university or some public universities these days.
When we started to see an influx of children last year, the New York Times did an expose and said that the defense contractors who are housing the children in converted Walmarts and in these warehouses made $1 billion, a contract worth $1 billion to house children. This is profit. We want these people to come here. We want to incarcerate them. We want to profit off of them. That sounds like hyperbole, but it's not. About 10 years ago, we had 5,000 immigrants in detention facilities. Today, we have over 50,000. We are the largest jailers of immigrants in the world.
So your thoughts on New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was among those who did not vote for that $4.6 billion to go to the border. She recently came under fire for comments made in an Instagram video in which she called immigrant prisons concentration camps.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border, and that is exactly what they are. They are concentration camps.
That's Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez later defending her remarks, tweeting, "And for the shrieking Republicans who don't know the difference, concentration camps are not the same as death camps. Concentration camps are considered by experts as the mass detention of civilians without trial, and that's exactly what this administration is doing." And yesterday, in the Capitol, you had 18 Jewish activists shoring up her comments, saying never again means never again.
Where are the voices? Where are the leaders? I mean, if you start to see children getting sick, if you start to see children dying, if these images of children sleeping on concrete floors, being separated from their parents, if lawmakers aren't willing to speak up, we're basically tacitly allowing this to happen on our own soil. They are concentration camps. I know that people get up in arms about words and semantics here, and I understand why. But we need to call a spade here. Otherwise, we're just going to allow it to continue.
We're going to go to break and then come back to our discussion with John Carlos Frey, 5-time Emmy Award-winning investigative reporter and PBS NewsHour special correspondent. His new book is called Sand and Blood, America's Stealth War on the Mexico Border. He'll tell us what happened to his own mother, who had a green card and lived in this country. Stay with us. Cancun by the Mexican classical guitar duo Rodrigo y Gabriela. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we continue our discussion with John Carlos Frey, author of Sand and Blood, America's Stealth War on the Mexico Border.
Well, the new book chronicles how the U.S.-Mexico border became a war zone through decades of deadly bipartisan immigration policy. But it also examines the border through the personal history of John Carlos Frey's family. Now, John, you were born in Tijuana, but you lived virtually all of your life in the United States on the San Diego side of the border. You were within eyesight of the border. So, and you talk in your book a very moving story about what happened to your mother, who was a permanent resident, was a green card holder in those days, that had an enormous impression on your view of the immigration problem.
Right. I watched my mother be deported before my eyes, even though she had legal residency in the United States.
Could you read that section?
Sure, absolutely. There's a story about it in the book. My mother was a Mexican woman with dark features and dark skin. She spoke English with a thick Mexican accent. That day, as she walked seemingly alone along the road near the U.S.-Mexico border, moving toward her where I was, she caught the attention of a Border Patrol agent who was looking for migrants. Agents would drive up and down our neighborhood streets regularly, always on the lookout for brown faces. This one stopped to question my mother about her immigration status, asking for identification. She told him she lived just up the road and could get ID from home. The agent didn't believe her. She told him that her husband was in the house and that he could stop by and ask him. He still didn't believe her. She told him that she had lived in the United States for 20 years and that I, her son, was playing nearby. Instead of listening to my mother's pleas, the agent put her in handcuffs and then in the back of his patrol car. She was deported. Obviously not legally deported, but she was sent to a holding facility in Tijuana. And my father, the next day when we found out where she was, had to go with her papers to get her back across. She never left the house again without her papers. She had a stack of papers proving her legal residency. She put them in her car, and she would always keep them in her purse. She never knew when she was going to be stopped again.
And you mentioned that this whole demonization of Mexican migration in your book dates back really to the early 20th century. And I was especially struck by the story you told of Carmelita Torres in 1917, who some historians have compared to the Mexican Rosa Parks for her protest. Could you talk about her story? 17-year-old girl and what happened?
Carmelita Torres was a resident of Juarez, Mexico, and was a housekeeper in El Paso. Every day she would cross the border and work at a wealthy family's home. This was a very common occurrence. You didn't need anything to get across the border from Juarez at the time to work in the United States. Labor was going back and forth all the time. And then there was a typhus scare. Typhus is spread by lice and fleas. And it was believed that Mexicans coming across the border to work were spreading this disease. So they started a typhus delousing station at the U.S.-Mexico border. Migrants who were coming across to work had to strip naked. They had to be deloused. They had to dip their entire body in a kerosene bath, and their clothes had to be steamed every single day. Their heads were checked for lice. If they found lice on their bodies, on their heads, their hair was shaved off. And then they could go to work. This was an everyday inspection process. So
if you were living in Mexico but working in the U.S. every single day, you would have to, in essence, be deloused at the border when you were going to work.
Correct. That is as if we were getting on a plane and going through TSA. This whole process of being inspected was by stripping naked and having your clothes clean and your body checked and dipped into this kerosene bath. And you couldn't get into the United States unless you went through that process on a regular basis. She got sick of it. Carmelita Torres got sick of it and said, from one day to the next, I'm not going to do this anymore. She had heard that some of the agents were taking photographs and posting them in a local bar of the nude women's bodies. So she said, I'm not going to do this. She rallied with a couple of other individuals in line waiting to be deloused, and there was a major protest that ensued. They actually had to shut down the port of entry that day. And she became a champion for those rights of immigrants being dehumanized in that process.
You dedicate your book to my mother, an immigrant from Mexico, came to America to provide a better life for me and my siblings, and to all the mothers and fathers who had the same intention and lost their lives in the attempt. How does what happened to you as a child, seeing your mother handcuffed and sent across the border illegally back to Mexico, inform what you do? And talk about your most recent work. We've interviewed you a number of times. One of those times was border agents killing a migrant along the border.
I think that my own personal history is why I do this. It's probably not the only reason. I am a journalist. I'm interested in places that are in conflict and are going through a period of injustice like we're seeing here. But I'm a bilingual, binational, born in Tijuana, growing up in the United States individual. So this is my beat. The U.S.-Mexico border is my beat. And seeing how my mother was treated, I don't see too many outlets, with the exception of yours, reporting on the injustices of border security. We think that migrant is bad and U.S. is good. So let's build a wall. Let's increase the Border Patrol. Let's make sure that they don't come here. We don't really talk about what happens down at the border. With respect to Border Patrol brutality and the way that they treat migrants, this is a story that has formed my career. I mean, this is why I come and I speak with all of you, is because of the way the U.S. treats migrants for the most part. You're talking about a case where an unarmed 15-year-old boy was shot 10 times in the back, standing in Mexico, while a U.S. agent standing in the United States opened fire and killed him. That Border Patrol agent was indicted, and there was a trial, and he was found not guilty. The boy never raised a weapon.
Cruz Velasquez.
Yes, in Nogales, Mexico. He never raised a weapon. He was unarmed. The only thing that was in his pocket was a cell phone. He's dead. Mexican nationals can't sue the United States either for wrongful death. So this family is without their kid and no legal recourse. This is U.S. policy.
Well, you also talk about that for many, many years, first certainly throughout most of the early 20th century, there was a fairly fluid situation at the border, people coming back and forth with not a whole lot. There was a Border Patrol established in 1924, but there wasn't really the kind of constant surveillance or seizing of people and sending them back. And you talk about the development of the border wall mentality in the more recent decades.
When I was a kid, there was no fence. Migrants would come across the border, yes, illegally.
And we're talking
paper.
now in the 60s and early
5 years ago when I was a kid. 30, 40 years ago, there was no border fence. There were fewer border guards. People would come, they would migrate. They would work in the fields, they'd go back home. And this was understood and known. Even though that people were entering without inspection, without papers, people looked the other way for the most part. I'm not quite sure what happened, what the flashpoint was, that we started to militarize the U.S.-Mexico border, but all of a sudden, immigrant became criminal, and we wanted to wall ourselves off from them. We have more undocumented immigrants in the United States than we've ever had because it's hard to get in. Now that people, when they finally do get in, they stay. And they not only stay, they bring their families in at a later time when they can. So we have this swelling effect because of the way that we manage our borders. I don't know that we've had a terrorist that's come up from Mexico. We haven't had some sort of an attack from Mexicans in the United States, and all of a sudden we have this sort of militarized infrastructure. It's somewhat of a mystery to me. I watched all of this happen bit by bit. I actually think it's a political construct. If I'm a politician and I want to run on keeping you safe from these immigrants, I could look like a knight in shining armor. And I think that that's what Trump and presidents before him have done.
And you make the point that during the Clinton administration, there was a real emphasis on beginning to not only militarize the border, but to go after undocumented immigrants. Now, interestingly, I remember that Bill Clinton, when he was governor of Arkansas, actually lost an election because he welcomed immigrants in Fort Chaffee, Cuban Marielitos who were basically housed in one of the facilities. And as a result of him welcoming them, he lost the governor's reelection race. And I think that's why when he finally became president, he reached the conclusion that anti-immigration posture was a better one for a politician in the United States than one of welcoming immigrants.
There's a portion of Clinton's State of the Union speech, his second year in office, that reads like Trump wrote it. We're going to go after illegal aliens. We're going to go after the criminals coming across the border. We're going to fortify the border. We're going to build border walls. We're going to hire more border guards. We're going to keep you safe. I'm actually paraphrasing, but that's the gist of his speech. That sounds like a Trump speech to me. Bill Clinton was the author, or at least his administration was the author, of the border walls and the way that we manage the border today. The laws that were set in place then are the laws that Donald Trump is standing on today and allowing him to do what he does.
Explain the progression of those laws.
Sure. In 1994, we had a policy that was enacted called the Border Patrol Strategy of 1994, Prevention Through Deterrence. Let's build border walls in front of San Diego, in front of El Paso, and a couple of other major cities along the border, and let's purposely force migration through the deserts and through the mountains. That's on purpose, because we're going to let the terrain take care of them. The Border Patrol knew that people were going to get sick, they were going to be dehydrated, this is all in the document, and that they may die. That is the policy that we have in place, as well as the detention facilities along the U.S.-Mexico border. Everything was geared to the fact that we were going to shake people up. They knew very well that they weren't going to keep people from coming, but if they did come, they were going to know that we meant business, and they were going to take that message of deterrence back home. We can fast forward 20 years plus today and see that it hasn't worked. And
of course, that led to the tragedy that still doesn't get sufficient coverage, which is all the migrant deaths. And you uncovered a story in, what was it, Brooks County, Texas, and Falfurrias, where a Baylor University professor began unearthing hundreds of skeletons of dead migrants just in this one county. Could you talk about that?
Sure. It's a story we covered extensively here. A cemetery, a county cemetery, where migrants were gathered in from coroners who had found bodies in and around the area. If a migrant dies, what do you do with the body? In this particular case, they were placed in a county cemetery as unidentified individuals. The graves were unmarked. There were no DNA samples taken for identification. In some cases, we found individuals 7 buried to a grave site. Dig a hole, put a migrant in the ground. Some people were buried 4 inches below ground. People were placed in plastic trash bags. It was a mass of humanity buried in a way which was inhumane. The anthropologist who was exhuming the bodies called it a mass grave.
You tell the moving story of Mike Wilson, a Tohono O'odham tribal member. Tell us his story, the story of one group of Native Americans responding to migrants.
Mike Wilson is a tribal member from the Tohono O'odham Nation, which is a Indian tribe, a Native American tribe on the U.S.-Mexico border. It is a smuggling corridor. Migrants come across the border on a regular basis, and they die in concentration. It is the deadliest region in the American Southwest for migrants to cross. It's hot desert. And he, a Presbyterian priest at the time, thought his religion and his religious duties called him to action. He started putting water out for migrants in the desert. And his own constituents, his own congregants, told him that if he put water out, that he was going to be attracting migrants into the desert. They fired him, and they kicked him off the reservation. This is a man who was trying to save lives, and as a result, lost, I don't know what you call it, lost his vestments. He was defrocked as a result of trying to save lives.
You also write in your book about John Hunter, the brother of the conservative Republican Congressman Duncan Hunter.
Duncan Hunter, U.S. Congressman from the San Diego region in California, was probably the strongest proponent of building walls. His brother, John Hunter, was his campaign manager and raised money for his campaigns as congressman. Congressman Duncan Hunter, I would say, was probably responsible for the first border walls that we got. He was really furious about making sure that we walled ourselves off from Mexico. When those walls went in place in San Diego, it forced migration into the deserts east of the city, and migrants started to die for the very first time. We saw, maybe in the years prior, 1 or 2 migrant bodies were found. Right after that, we were finding 50, 60, up to 100 migrant bodies. John Hunter, his brother, felt responsible. He started to put water out for them, and to this day maintains a humanitarian group who continues to put water out in the desert.
Speaking of humanitarian groups, you went to a No More Deaths camp. Right. We've been covering the story of Scott Warren. A jury did not find him guilty, but it was 8-4 for his innocence. And the Trump administration, at the same time when the uproar was happening around the Clint child jail, announces they're going to re-prosecute Scott, who is a geographer, professor, and activist who's been dedicated with so many other activists to putting out water in the Sonoran Desert with Aho Samaritans, as well as No More Deaths. Finding bones and bodies of immigrants as he goes. He's the one who is being retried. Talk about your experience with these camps.
I don't know that it would it wouldn't affect people any differently than it has me, but I've seen the bodies. I've walked up to a dehydrated, dead individual in the desert. I've seen women, young children, and I've talked to the survivors. I've gone on the journey myself. I know how difficult it is. I've traveled with a migrant group. The idea that a humanitarian providing water and sustenance for someone on that journey, it's not necessarily to allow them to get into the country illegally, it's to save their life. There's a serious problem in our government if you're going to prosecute the individual who's trying to save someone's life. I hate to say it, it sounds so hyperbolic to say it, but the more that I'm looking at this lately, we're on this step-by-step approach to genocide here. We are in the process of dehumanizing people to such a degree that it is okay for them to die, even to the point where the government is saying, let them die. Let's prosecute the humanitarian who's trying to save their life. Let's put him in jail so he can't save their lives. We are allowing people to die, children in custody, people crossing the border. I'm passionate about it, of course, but I'm also standing on very solid ground here. If we take a look at any history where this kind of a movement has happened, the government has turned its back. Where are the people screaming that this guy is saving lives as opposed to trying to put him in jail for putting water out? That to me is a shock.
I want to ask you, as someone who's grown up in the border areas, the Southwest has been the basis of the biggest growth for American population in the last maybe 50, 60 years. 6 of the 10 largest cities in America are in the Sun Belt. San Diego, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio. Where would the Southwest be without Mexican labor, whether it's domestic Mexican labor or immigrant Mexican labor?
It certainly wouldn't be where it is, and we actually imported that labor to begin with. I mean, we had the Bracero program where we invited almost 5 million Mexican farm workers to come and harvest our crops while our men were off to war in World War II. So many of those Mexican-American neighborhoods were started back in that time. Many of our roots from that culture there in the American Southwest come from that labor pool that we had at that time.
We're going to break and then come back to our discussion. We're spending the hour with John Carlos Frey, 5-time Emmy Award-winning investigative reporter, PBS NewsHour special correspondent, who reports extensively on immigration and on migrant deaths. He has a new book out. It's called Sand and Blood, America's Stealth War on the Mexico Border. When we come back, we'll look at the connection between climate change and migration. Stay with us.
Aquí estoy establecido en los Estados Unidos, 10 años pasaron ya, en que crucé de mojado y papeles no he arreglado, sigo siendo un ilegal. Tengo mi esposa y mis hijos, que me los traje muy chicos y se han olvidado ya de mi México querido, del que yo nunca me olvido y no puedo regresar. ¿De qué me sirve el dinero si estoy como prisionero?
The Golden Cage by Los Tigres del Norte. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. John Carlos Frey is with us for the hour discussing his new book, Sand and Blood, America's Stealth War on the Mexico Border. We're going to turn now to an underreported force driving people to the border, climate change. This is a clip from John Carlos Frey's project that he did with the Weather Channel on the climate migration crisis, where he asks several Hondurans about what's happening to them, why they joined a migrant caravan.
I find a lot of people who worked on farms and say that they fled because of the drought.
Listen, the drought was really bad drought. The corn cobs were really small.
Among the farm workers who joined the caravan in Honduras was Pedro Castillo.
We always plant so we can have food to eat. Rice, beans, and corn. Many people, that's how we survive. A lot of us survive on less than $1 a day.
With all due respect, I just want to say that is a life of poverty. Am I right?
That is the reality of the Honduran people. We've been absorbed by poverty. And not because we're lazy. With Mother Nature, there's nothing you can do. With the drought, there's nothing you can do.
Perhaps the one thing you can do is flee. That's what Fabiola Diaz and Carlos Salinas are doing. They and their kids are traveling together, even though they didn't know each other before. They're not a couple, but they seem like a family. Fabiola and her 2-year-old son Yeltsin come from a Honduran town called Santa Barbara. What type of work do they do there?
There, I do farm labor. Beans, corn. It's what's mostly grown there. Right now, in the year we're in, the harvest didn't work out for anyone.
That's John Carlos Frey interviewing people, part of the migrant caravan in Mexico City, headed to the United States. He did this project for the Weather Channel on the climate migration crisis. Would you call these refugees climate refugees?
100%. There is no other way to refer to them. These are people who have farmed their land for millennia. We're talking about the region where the Mayans are. So corn and beans have been grown there for hundreds of years. All of a sudden, the rains come, the crops start to grow, and then they dry up. The rains don't continue. This has been going on for 5 years. In some places that I visited in Guatemala, they have 100% crop failure. They've been able to harvest absolutely nothing. And most of these communities are based on the agricultural economy. If the crops don't come in, there is no other job. Everything in the town relies on the harvest. So I've spoken to people who were living on 1 tortilla a day. They've tried everything. They've tried to sell their farm equipment, their farm animals, their land to stay in country. They look for jobs in the major cities close by, and they still haven't been able to find work. The United Nations has placed 2.1 million people from the region. They've labeled them as food insecure. That is the first step right before famine. We are looking at, if this drought continues, we are looking at all-out famine from Central America. And from what I found when I was interviewing these people in the caravan, that's one of the major reasons why they're coming. And we're not reporting on that at all. The government doesn't even acknowledge the fact that there is a climate crisis in Central America.
Let's go to another clip from the series that you produced with the Weather Channel on the climate migration crisis. This begins with an attorney who's working with migrants in a caravan traveling through Mexico to the U.S. border.
This is not an invasion. This is a drop in the bucket of what comes to the border every month, every week.
Atenas Barola is an attorney from North Carolina who's part of a group that's come to Mexico to advise the migrants on U.S. asylum law. I'm following the story of a young woman who is fleeing because of poverty and hunger. She's living on a meal a day. Does she qualify for asylum if that's the only reason that she's fleeing?
If that is the only reason that she's fleeing, unfortunately in the United States she is not going to qualify for asylum.
Is she not fleeing for her life? Is she not possibly in danger of her life if she doesn't get food?
She probably is, but the way that the U.S. asylum law is written is that it is for people who are fleeing persecution, not economic insecurity.
That was your interview with attorney Atenas Berola. Talk about that.
I was asking her that this woman can't feed her child. She's in fear for her life. She herself was emaciated. Her child was thin. She couldn't put any food on the table. A woman by herself, 25 years old, with a 2-year-old, is making this journey from Honduras to the United States. And I was asking the attorney, what rights does she have once she gets to the U.S.-Mexico border? She has none. She cannot claim asylum. Our asylum laws do not allow for someone who is a victim of poverty or hunger to come into the United States.
So what do you see as the way forward here? Because clearly there is still a significant portion of the American population that is rallying to President Trump's continued insistence on closing the border. And yet more and more people are continuing to come. The president's talking now about mass raids again, threatening mass raids again. Where do you see the country moving?
I don't see it getting any better. I don't want to be a pessimist, but this is the worst I've ever seen it, and I've been reporting on these issues for a long time. You have a president of the United States who is vilifying these people to the point where it's okay that they die, to the point where it's okay that we incarcerate children and we treat them inhumanely. That is okay by our federal government. I don't see anyone in his party speaking out against these actions or advocating on behalf of migrant children. Children we're not advocating for. So this is a serious problem. As long as we have the leader of our country advocating for more of the same, I think we're going to see more of the same. And it's very hard for Congress to break through.
Will it take possible unrest in the immigrant and Latino community at levels we haven't seen since the immigration protests of 2006 before something will change?
We're starting to see it, and we're starting to see Democratic candidates start to advocate on behalf of these individuals. So that has become part of the platform. I've never seen a presidential candidate say publicly that he would advocate on behalf of health care for the undocumented. That was a shock to me, that if we get a new health care system in this country, that undocumented immigrants would qualify.
And every single candidate raised their hand,
so
Democratic presidential
I think
primary.
he's pushing the candidates in that corner.
When we last talked to you, you talked about how hundreds of migrants were feared dead in mass graves at the Barry Goldwater bombing range in Arizona. Are there any updates on this?
There are no updates. The federal government has closed off this region from humanitarian assistance. There is a stretch of land in Arizona that migrants cross through to get to a road. It's about 30 miles of a bombing range that Border Patrol agents don't touch, that human rights people, advocates, humanitarians don't touch. And we have had 911 calls from this region. We know that people have died there, and we know that people need water there. And the government has forbidden. Year after year, there are petitions to at least put out some form of humanitarian assistance, and we haven't. I am convinced there are mass graves. There are hundreds of bodies that have been left unrecovered. We've been trying for a long time to get in to document that, but we're not allowed.
Which brings us to the title of your book, Sand and Blood. Why?
This is a region of the United States that I think that most people don't know, a region of desert and mountain, the most inhospitable terrain in the United States. This is the path that we've allowed migrants to cross. We've seen these gruesome pictures of a father with his child drowned in the Rio Grande, stories of people dying in the deserts, the mass graves. We have a casualty list now. That is a result of a war. If we have thousands upon thousands of people who have died as a result of a policy that has not changed, that feels like war to me. I don't think there's a road in New York City if there is a mass toll of death caused by the traffic light or the bad curve on the street that it wouldn't be repaired immediately for safety. We've not changed policy in almost 30 years, and we have a death toll that doesn't seem to even permeate the members of Congress and the administration.
What should the presidential candidates be asked?
They should be asked if they believe that a migrant life is equal to a U.S. citizen's life. And if so, then you're going to have to treat them as such.
We want to thank you very much for joining us. John Carlos Frey, 5-time Emmy Award-winning investigative reporter, PBS NewsHour special correspondent. His book is just out. It's called Sand and Blood: America's Stealth War on the Mexico Border. To hear our discussion in Spanish, you can go also to our website at democracynow.org, to Democracy Now! En Espanol. This is Democracy Now! Democracy Now! Is currently accepting applications for year-long paid video production fellowships here in our New York studio. Learn more at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.